Subscribe to James the Sheriff Dixon, you motherfuckers.
So, this is the start of the podcast, and we did this like I did last time, but I did this on Discord call instead of a phone call. So, I don't know what happened, but Discord like disconnected us like halfway through the call. So that's what you're gonna see in this podcast. That's why it like jumps from one thing to another thing. But other than that, I got the full podcast this time, and I hope you enjoy this podcast, everybody. All right, now we are recording. Do you want to do your intro?
Sure. What's up, everybody? I'm Dan Mills. I'm here with James the Sheriff Dixon. I'm thankful to be a guest once again on his weekly pod. How's that?
That's great. We're back again with episode 4, and we're going to talk about 80s cop like action in movies.
That's right.
So let's...
most notably, the ones that you just saw were sorry, I'm fucking around with my lighter back here.
That's fine.
The one that you just saw was you just saw Lethal Weapon, and you were just familiarizing. Last time we spoke, you were familiarizing yourself with the Die Hard franchise as well, correct?
Yeah.
What did you think of Lethal Weapon?
If I didn't see Die Hard first, I would say like because Lethal Weapon. That's the same actor from Die Hard, right? The guy that's in Lethal Weapon.
No. Lethal Weapon is Mel Gibson, babe.
I thought it looked like the same guy.
Yeah, they all kind of have the same sort of look. They're sort of just a rough and tumble, like 80s guy with the tank top and the butt jeans and all that. Yeah, it's not by accident that those guys look the same.
I was gonna say like because they had the same look. If I saw that movie before Die Hard, but since I saw Die Hard first, I would say I could see since I've still only seen the first 3 Die Hards, I could see John McClane ending up like the crazy cop from Mel Gibson's character from Lethal Weapon ending up like how he ended up.
Riggs.
Yep.
Yeah. That's interesting sorry, one sec.
It's all right.
Yeah, it's that's an interesting thing to think about. If Holly Gennaro McClane, who was John McClane's wife in the first Die Hard, and spoiler alert for those of you who haven't seen Die Hard, if he had been unsuccessful in saving her,
there's really no spoilers for Die Hard if they haven't. It's been out for like a long time.
I mean, just to be polite.
Yeah.
Had John McClane been unsuccessful in saving Holly Gennaro McClane, it stands to reason that he might have ended up similar to Riggs.
That's what I was saying. Like, I think if it wasn't called Lethal Weapon, I think it would have been like a sequel to like Die Hard.
Yeah, they have different backstories. Like John McClane, definitely more of a cop, like just sort of a regular kind of everyman kind of cop who was thrust into this crazy situation. Where Riggs is the lethal weapon. Yeah. Like he is the guy who like he fell into police work because there's the only thing that he could handle after being in the.
Yep, like he would do the things like the other cops like wouldn't do.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's a little bit more of a sort of progressive kind of vibe with Lethal Weapon as well, considering that they both have more or less in Die Hard. He has black part like Riggs does in Murtaugh in Lethal Weapon, and in Lethal Weapon, Murtaugh is a character who does things. Whereas, like, Sheriff, I think his name, or not Sheriff, Sergeant, I think his name is Al Poole in Die Hard. He doesn't, like the guy on the ground, like his de facto partner, doesn't really do anything. He just kind of, like, stays on the ground and tells John the kind of things that he sees that are going on.
Yeah.
And it's not until Die Hard 3, Die Hard with a Vengeance, that we get John McClane like a real partner in Samuel L. Jackson and Zeus.
Really, yeah, that's true. Like,
and things really click really, really nice.
Yeah, like the first two, he just has like in the Die Hard ones, he just has like a guy from the precinct that he's currently at with him, and then yeah.
Right. I think they're both incredible movies, and they're both Christmas time movies as well, which is an interesting.
I just remembered. Yeah, Lethal Weapon also starts off with Christmas. It's the same way as Die Hard. That's why I was like.
And they're both in L.A.
Yeah, that's why I was like,
which is funny too.
If I didn't see Die Hard first, again, I would have thought this would have been like a direct sequel, like how John McClane would have ended up this way. If so, his wife does leave him in the third Die Hard movie.
Yes.
Die Hard spoiler.
Which is why he's such a wreck. Yeah. And he is sort of in a more of a position like Riggs. Like he's veering more into the super cop that can do absolutely everything, rather than a guy that's put in an emergency situation. Mm-hmm. Like he fits more snugly into the role of the sort of prototypical '80s super cop. Even though I believe Die Hard with a Vengeance came out in like '92. You'll have to check my dates on it. I don't remember precisely the year that it came out, but it wasn't an '80s movie. It was a '90s movie.
Yeah, it was right at. I think the second one was the last '80s one, I believe, for Die Hard.
Right at the end, yeah. Right at the end of the '80s. But no, they're both really, really fun, and they both, as the franchise sort of began and evolved, and not just those, there was stuff like Beverly Hills Cop and 48 Hours, which is one that I definitely recommend you watch next if you're going to continue with this 80s cop thing.
I'll watch 48 Hours, and I'll look up Beverly Hills Cop as well. I've heard of Beverly
48
Hills
Hours is great.
I've heard of both of those movies.
Beverly Hills Cop is awesome, and it's I can talk about that one in an interesting way in a little bit. But what I was getting at is those cop movies are sort of indicative of like that style of hero.
Yeah,
we were just saying that John McClane and Riggs were so similar.
Yeah.
That super cop kind of hero was kind of I mean, we had superhero movies back then. You know, we had Tim Burton's Batman, and we had Superman since the 70s, and there were superhero movies. There was even a Punisher movie with Dolph Lundgren.
Before the John Berthel Punisher on Netflix. Yep.
Yeah, and then there was the Tom Jane one in the early 2000s, which was amazing. If you haven't seen, that's my Punisher. Is the Tom Jane? That's my favorite one.
Oh, I didn't know there were two Punisher movies. I only heard of the 2000s version. I didn't know there was a earlier one.
There's the one with Tom Jane, which is called The Punisher, and then the Punisher Warzone, which came out later, which didn't have Tom Jane, which was not as
good,
well received.
Yeah.
I can't say if it was good or not. I hadn't seen it, but I definitely know it was not as well received. But what I was saying was those sort of super cop movies, they created characters and character tropes and allowed for expansion of backstory and continuing stories that built on one another that led to the franchises of just like lots of movies about the same characters dealing with a new bad guy each time.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the industry realized the success rate of the sort of proven audience kind of element. Where they're like, oh, well, if you like Die Hard, we're going to make another one. Then we're going to make another one. If they found out they continue to make them. Exactly. And that model, that sort of sales model, is one that they applied to the MCU and a lot of other movies. Like, not just that. Like, just like franchising movies is something that they realized was successful.
Like the new Jurassic Park ones, too, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it became kind of an industry standard. Which a lot of people have a problem with, and to a degree, and a lot of people also enjoy it. But there's something to be said that's a little like when you have the same people making the same kinds of movies about the same character over and over again. That costs so much money,
and it gets like stale.
It not necessarily stale but it doesn't leave as much room for. Like new and original things.
Yeah. No stories, what you're trying to say. Like, new stories and, like, ideas.
And and like some people find that annoying and frustrating. Certainly, as a person who's trying to like write and sell original stories, myself as like a person in LA, it's kind of difficult because the studios don't want to take a risk on something new when they have franchises that they've built with proven audiences where they can have like statistics and analytics that'll say like if we continue on with this, it's a safer bet.
Fast and Furious is the one that comes to mind where they.
Fast and Furious is a perfect fucking example of that.
Yeah, that just kind of came to mind
and
as you were talking about that.
Yeah, that's also an example of how those franchises can start as something that
change
like
it.
if you put the first movie of the franchise and then the most recent movie of the franchise, they're almost unrecognizable from one another.
Yeah, like they're about like family or like I've only seen a few of them, but like I've heard they're like about like family. I think now, not just about.
That's kind of the joke is that like that's what Dom says that like the fact it's like all that they're doing is about family and loyalty and stuff, but really they're just superheroes with cars. Like they're just like they can do everything with cars and they fight villains that use cars and motorcycles and machines and stuff. And it's like it's no longer about like a tight knit group of thieves who steal cars. They're like a super team.
And they're always trying to top each other in those movies.
Yeah. There was that sort of franchising thing. I think comes from that cop model of the '80s.
I can kind of see that now. Yeah.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, too, because even Beverly Hills Cop, the first one...
I don't mind if you like talk about it. I'm still going to watch it like I did with Lethal.
You should definitely still watch it. And I'm not going to spoil it or anything. But the sort of type of story that it is a black cop comes from another place where he is... to come to a place where he is sort of out of place, like on vacation.
Yeah.
He comes, I think his name's Axel Foley, is Eddie Murphy's character in Beverly Hills Cop, and he's a Detroit detective, and he comes to LA for vacation, and he gets caught up in a case that the Beverly Hills Police Department is working on, and uses his sort of, his skills that make him so good at his job in Detroit, he applies them in this place where he's totally,
in LA.
An outlier.
Yeah, just skills from Detroit and LA, pretty much. In
California. And it's, right. And when you consider, and there's definitely like a racial, a racial element like to that. Like it's not just that he's from Detroit; it's that he's a black cop from Detroit in a predominantly white. An affluent area, but you can not necessarily combine, but you can compare
to
Beverly Hills Cop to another movie that came out starring Sidney Poitier called In the Heat of the Night.
Oh, I've heard of that one.
It's an awesome movie, and it's very, very similar. So much so that I would venture to say that Beverly Hills Cop is a sort of adaptation of In the Heat of the Night. Which is about a black Chicago detective who comes down on vacation to see his mother gets embroiled in a murder case in the South. The difference being it takes place in like the 1960s, so the racial prejudice element is much, much stronger. Whereas in Beverly Hills Cop in the 80s, they can play around with it a little more, and it's a little more humor. And Eddie Murphy has a little bit more of the upper hand immediately, whereas he's not fighting against like Jim Crow prejudice in the Deep South with the other police. But that's a really cool double feature if you wanted to watch In the Heat of the Night and then watch Beverly Hills Cop and compare and contrast. Those are two really interesting movies. And then of course they made like 6 fucking Beverly Hills Cop movies.
Right, like they did with the Die Hards and then the. Yeah, Lethal Weapon.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's fun, and I really like those movies. Like I like those super cop movies. I think they're really, really cool, and in a way, I enjoy them. I mean, I'm a huge comic guy.
Yeah.
especially if you watch my show, El Rey Nation.
Yeah, I've seen.
we talk about
Like I said, I've
comics
seen a
almost
few episodes
exclusively.
since our. Like I said, I've seen a few episodes since our last podcast.
Thank you for watching. Everybody should watch the show. It's a great show that's full of really, really talented people who work really hard.
If you like
Navarro,
movies,
Vanessa
you'll like
Gritton.
that show.
Yeah, if you like movies, comics, gaming, and more is what we say. Starring Hector Navarro, Kelly Nugent, Vanessa Gritton, and Cameron Rice. They're the 4 central cast members, and they are all extremely knowledgeable and funny and personable, and they are great. If you haven't watched El Rey Nation, check it out. It's on iTunes, El Rey Network, obviously on cable, and Amazon Prime. Sorry, I had to do a little plug there.
I don't mind.
But yeah, if you like talk like this, watch that show. And there's a couple episodes where we talk about things like this too. I love those movies. I love those sort of super cop movies. And in a way, they're a little bit more fun than superhero movies right now, because I think a lot of, especially after Endgame has come and gone,
it's dying down the super, especially after.
I think what they call it is it's like superhero fatigue. It's been something that's been happening every year, multiple times a year for upwards of 10 years.
Yep, since Iron Man came out in 2008.
It's just a lot. It's just a lot.
RoboCop technically falls under that cop.
RoboCop absolutely falls under that category as well.
Because I started thinking about that since we started this conversation, RoboCop, but that's one I've seen.
Yeah. RoboCop is great, and RoboCop is also one that they've kind of brought back into the fold with the, I want to say it was a 2013 or 14.
I haven't seen the remake, because I didn't want it to ruin the original, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, the original's wonderful. Like, the original RoboCop is a fucking classic. Like, that's a great movie. I haven't seen the new RoboCop, but I hear it's pretty good. Actually, a buddy of mine that I play D&D with, a friend that I went to college with, he did for that RoboCop movie, and he said it's pretty great. Okay. So check that out. He'll get some royalty checks for anybody who watches that movie. But that's what I guess I wanted to say today, is that when you start thinking about those movies in the beginning of film franchising really started in the 1980s.
Branched out from there. As
far as action movies with those cop stories, because of course there were comedy franchises.
Yeah.
That started in the 70s, but the real strong, long-lasting action movies that just continued to get more and more, I don't want to say preposterous because that has a negative connotation to it, but just more and more unbelievably action-packed, and that sort of started with that, and I think that not Lethal Weapon, but 48 Hours was one. Another one featuring Eddie Murphy, actually. That was one that really amped up how gritty and sort of ludicrous they could get with the action in every element. In that, if you watch 48 Hours, it's like when they were writing every scene, they were just like, how can we make this as intense as possible?
Oh yeah. I've seen movies similar like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really great. Like, Nick Nolte and Eddie Murphy are awesome, and that's a different one too, because they instead of a lot of the other sort of super cop duo movies, 48 Hours, Nick Nolte is the detective and Eddie Murphy is a criminal that he's working with, and they hate each other, and they're just forced together by circumstance for the case.
I've definitely seen movies
so
like
much
that.
It's much more similar to Die Hard with a Vengeance.
Yeah.
So Die Hard with a Vengeance takes a lot of pages from another 48 Hours book and applies it to the pre-established franchise. The reason why some people get frustrated with those two, I think, especially from a creative standpoint, is that these people who create these franchises, they make a lot of money and are obviously, as a result, are very, very protective with that brand.
Yeah.
And with that IP. So it's more difficult to sort of break in and do new things with those franchises, because the people who are working on and created it, and rightfully so. It's their the creative contents, their IP. Bruce Willis, for example, is very, very protective of the IP of Die Hard.
Yep.
They are very, very precious with it, so it disallows a lot of new freshness or new ideas or elements to be introduced into those franchises in a time where racial diversity, for example, is you can only make so many movies about a white cop doing stuff and kind of breaking the law as he's upholding the law in this day and age.
And a lot of the buddy cop movies, they have at least one of those in their franchise, don't they?
Which?
And a lot of those buddy cop movies, don't they have one of those racial things in their at least one movie about that situation? Yes,
they do, but it's not necessarily just and I don't want to use the word tokenism, but it's not necessarily just the inclusion of one black character here and there, or one person of color here and there, as a sidekick or whatever. At the crux of all of these, it's one white cop who's kind of using, it's the loose cannon cop on the edge who doesn't play by the rules, and they're in this day and age, a cop kind of doing what cops aren't supposed to do, just on their gut instinct and sort of not following the law, is a little bit of a stickier situation. Like a white cop kind of going outside of the law to uphold the law is less of an acceptable for a film now than it was back then.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you factor in how audiences of color are going to respond to it.
Yeah.
However, I think a lot of those movies are still great, and understanding them, appreciating them for their time, I think is totally acceptable, and everybody should watch those movies if they're into that sort of thing. They're really, really
over the cop ones. I definitely like the Marvel movies.
Oh yeah, I mean they're more modern and they got more of a sci-fi vibe. They're a lot more eclectic because of their sci-fi element, and because there's such a huge cast of characters that can do so many things. It's much more of a colorful.
Yep.
It's much more of a colorful experience, and I don't mean that racially. Although the MCU has done a better job than the cop franchises that came before it, in including people of color and women certainly as well. But yeah, that's not. Yeah, it's certainly easier, I would say, to enjoy Marvel stuff than some of the older cop franchises, just because it's more contemporary, if anything else.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I just went on a huge diatribe about that shit. I'm sorry about.
Is John Wick fall under that? Because I also watched that as well when I watched.
Yeah, I think you're right that John Wick does sort of it definitely, any sort of franchise about a lone hero guy who's doing his thing, and then each time they amp up that is the nature of it. You got a character and he can exist in all these movies. Each time it's just oh shit, what's he gonna do this time? What's John McClane gonna do this time? What's Riggs gonna do this time? What's fucking I forget the name, or what's John Wick gonna do this time? You know, I think that definitely falls under what's Dom and the rest of the Fast and the Furious guys gonna do this. That definitely falls under that. Same with Mission Impossible, even though the sort of espionage style.
Oh yeah, the James Bond movies.
Yeah, those predate the Super Cop, because those James Bond movies were coming off of the Ian Fleming novels. Those movies were being made, in the 60s, even through today. You can even say that is a more prototypical sort of franchise model than the Super Cop.
Even though they're not being
just that
made right now, they're probably going to be made in another couple years to a decade from now. Still,
James Bond movies.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're still making James Bond movies. What was the last one that came out? Spectre?
Yeah,
and then the next one is coming out next year?
Yeah, I didn't think they were making any movies. I thought it was almost 5 years ago, I think that one came out, right?
Which one?
Spectre.
Which year was that? Was that 20... I want to say 50... No. That can't be right. 2016?
Still almost.
Christ, it's 2020.
Yeah,
It's been a lot. They
gonna
definitely
say
don't
it's-
come out as regularly because they're so huge.
Yeah.
And I think that there's some, especially more recently, there's been some disputes with Daniel Craig, like not wanting to play Bond anymore, and they just keep offering him like absurd amounts of money
And that's why
to
they're
play
so
this
far.
character that he's very done with.
That's why they're so far
But, like,
apart. And that's why they're so far apart
who's-
when filming.
And also just like the logistics of filming a James Bond movie. I mean, like you've seen James Bond movies; they go all over the world. They do insane stuff.
Yeah.
You know, it's and that brand, because it's so much older, they are even more precious at that.
Mhm.
You know, they have to make sure that they nail James Bond stuff, and even then, even when they take such great care, there's still ones that aren't as successful. You know, like Spectre wasn't, in my opinion, wasn't anywhere near as good as Skyfall, which
Mhm.
one of the best James
Yeah,
Bond movies.
I've heard that's a
fucking
lot of.
ever.
I've heard that's a lot of people's favorites. Is Spectre, not the Spectre, the Skyfall one.
Skyfall's fucking wonderful. We could do a whole goddamn podcast on James
If you want
Bond
to talk
and
about
how-
a little bit
and
about
how
that,
Skyfall is.
you want to talk about that right now? Go ahead.
No, I'm not like fully prepared to just like go off the again. I'll just kind of ramble on about it. For a new fan of James Bond, and for old fans of James Bond who appreciate the development and evolution of the franchise and the character, Skyfall is great for old fans and new fans in its like contemporary story. It's sort of it's moral complexity.
Mm-hmm.
It's like its establishment of like a real human element of the James Bond character.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fan service. It's got really, really incredible fan service and details in it that James Bond fans who've been with the franchise for, you know, their whole lives, or like since it began in some cases. There's really, really fun things in Skyfall for people that have been watching James Bond since the beginning. So I definitely recommend that movie. I think it's fucking great. And Javier Bardem is an amazing, amazing actor and a wonderful villain in that movie. Maybe my favorite James Bond villain. I forget his name. I want to say Salazar, but that's his name in Pirates of the Caribbean.
the villain from the last one, yeah.
Yeah.
You could also say Pirates of the Caribbean was kind of drawn.
Which one?
You could say the Pirates franchise was drawn from the.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sort of deal, is that model, once they discovered the success rate of that model and how like safe a bet, because essentially the deal is like the studios want to hedge their bets as much as possible and make sure that they can make as much money on the gamble that is emotion, right? They put up front, they put up a shitload of money to make a movie, and then they make it, and they roll the dice to see how much money that they can get back to even break even and then make a profit. And they realized with all these cop movies and like James Bond as well, but certainly the cop movies, that when you have a character that they can follow, you have a proven audience that you can use analytics from previous movies to be like, okay, cool, so we can use this mathematics to sort of predict how well like people are going to see this movie because they're fans of this character or they're fans of this franchise. We don't have to sell them on a brand new thing. So it's a way for the studios to sort of hedge their bets and make it a more sure thing that they're going to make their money back, which is important for them considering how much these goddamn movies cost.
And especially no Disney goes like all out on like their movies.
Say that again?
I said Disney especially goes like all out like on their movies.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Pirates was the Pirates movies are extremely expensive to create, and I mean a lot of them are. Pirates is the added sort of hurdle of being a period piece, in addition to being like a huge, you know, sort of supernatural action movie.
Yeah.
You know, it takes place in like what I want to say like the 15th century, 16th century.
Yeah. Somewhere around the 16th, 1700s,
so,
yeah.
So, yeah, you have that too. And I really love those movies. I fucking love the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. Even the ones aren't good, in my opinion, like the most recent two,
The fourth and
fifth
one.
Yeah, I think that
third one was my favorite.
Whether it was by accident or not. At World's End was a great. I fucking loved that movie. I thought that was an awesome culmination of that trilogy. I think that they ran into a little bit of trouble when they tried to continue on with it, and they didn't really have. There's some really great video essays that sort of give you an exploded view of the franchise and determine why
they kept going.
Like what elements they included in the first three, and that built upon the first three to make those three systems, and which elements were disincluded or added on
into the fourth and
in
fifth
the other ones exactly that led to them being
so successful as the first three.
Right, because I think Pirates of the Caribbean, Curse of the Black Pearl, the first, be it accidental or otherwise, is something of a perfect movie. I think that they utilize their themes really well. Their characters are established nicely. They're versatile and they're focused. And the movie, I want to say Jim Hammer directed that movie. It all flows really, really nicely. All the
everyone says the first one's
and everything.
Everyone says the first one's the best one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, really good. And Johnny Depp establishing Jack Sparrow as sort of as the Jack Sparrow that we know really was the
Johnny Depp
not
is
even
like
necessarily like the icing on the cake, but just like the cake itself and the rest of it was just like, oh, this is all really great outside of this wonderful character.
Johnny Depp is the Jack Sparrow of the Pirates universe, as Iron Man Robert Downey Jr. is to the MCU.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's where they sort of made a mistake. Not necessarily. Well, I don't want to say made a mistake because I don't want to be negative about it. But I think that when they started to play around a little bit more and they
get more freely with the story.
A lot of the success or failure of a Pirates of the Caribbean movie, I think, leans really, really hard on what Jack Sparrow is doing and how Johnny Depp is like utilizing the character and how much his heart's in it.
Yeah. And
I think that it's easy to see in the earlier movies that his heart is much more in it, and the story makes a little bit more sense for him. In those first three, and it's difficult to continue on with that character because he doesn't necessarily, like, his arc doesn't necessarily have like a lot of curve to it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Like,
he's
at the
kind
beginning
of
and end of each one of the
He's kind of the same throughout. He doesn't really like learn a lesson through the trilogy. He doesn't.
Yeah, and if you look at it like each Pirates movie, he's in the same.
Hang on a sec. Hang on a sec. You're breaking up. I can't. Hello? Alright, it's recording now.
Do you remember where it was? Because I actually think the last thing I said was I lost my train of thought.
We were talking about Johnny Depp and an Iron Man being yeah.
Yeah, they're sort of the characters that are at the crux of like that those franchises, at the heart of those franchises, that character. And when Jack Sparrow or Johnny Depp, or however you want to say it, I don't want to be like super negative about it because I love Johnny Depp, I love his work. When he is weaker, and he doesn't bring it as hard if he's not as like dedicated.
Mm-hmm.
And fuck, I don't want to say that like he wasn't dedicated because I don't know the man, but there's a difference between the Jack Sparrow that we get in the last two Pirates of the Caribbean movies.
That is definitely true. I remember seeing the fifth one in theaters, and like there's definitely a different like energy you get from playing
and likewise with Iron Man, if you don't, if Iron Man isn't bringing it, if Jack Sparrow isn't bringing it, then you got a soft core. You're sort of building your house.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a lot of pressure for an actor. And there's a certain, like, feels fatigued and seeing over and over again the way that we're sort of experiencing it now, like I mentioned before. Actors, I think, experience the same fucking thing. Want to be creative, and they want to explore different projects. And the same character 3, 8, 10 fucking times, however many times Robert Downey Jr. has played Iron Man.
Yeah.
I imagine that there is an element of fatigue if if they are experiencing that, or if the stories aren't as well crafted or what have you. And that's what we see with Daniel Craig now. Like, he's definitely sort of worn out playing James Bond, and family wants to spend more time with his young children, and instead of jet setting around the world in these huge productions that take years to create. You run into an actor's fatigue from the character as well. So there's a lot of things to consider. There's a lot of benefit on the studio side for this sort of franchise market model. But then on the other hand, there are factors for the actors, and there's factors for the audience too to consider in. It's like, sometimes we might get tired of something, or sometimes the actors might get tired of something. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But unlike Johnny Depp, like, not to hate, but I didn't see Robert Downey Jr. get tired of him throughout his run.
He did an amazing job at keeping up with Iron Man. I think that he really connected with Iron Man in a way that really kept him strong through that. And he's also a brilliant fucking performer. Not to say that Johnny Depp.
I do love Johnny Depp in other movies. Again, I think I told you this. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, Chaplin, The Judge. Those are 3 of my non-Iron Man related Robert Downey Jr. favorite movies of mine.
I just watched The Judge for the first time, actually, last week, and fucking loved it. I thought he was great in it.
One of my personal favorites.
Yeah, that was really, really good. Getting to see him with Vincent D'Onofrio, who's another favorite of mine, and Robert Duvall, who's obviously a legend, in a nice, well put together story that was sort of less intense, but still, very nicely emotionally driven and nicely character driven, was really, really cool, and I really enjoyed that movie a lot. And I think that's important for actors to do. Is they should do things in between they're doing these characters that they're playing over and over and over again. It's important for them, I think, to find these smaller projects, quote unquote smaller projects, where they can sort of stretch their legs and play different things so they can come back fresh.
I bet you we could probably
to these franchise rules.
I bet you we could probably do a whole podcast on Robert Downey Jr. itself as well.
I bet we could. Robert Downey Jr. is fucking amazing. I think he was an excellent cast for Tony Stark. And I forget, what was the chap's name? He was in Chef. He directed the first Iron Man movie. He did Swingers. He did Chef. He plays Happy in the MCU.
The guy who plays Happy directed the.
Yeah. He directed the first 2 Iron Man movies.
No, I don't know. I don't know his.
I
know who you're talking about. I know who you're talking about, but I don't know the guy's name.
Jon Favreau is his.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And he initially pushed for Robert Downey Jr. to play Iron Man because he wanted somebody who inherently and personally understood what it's like to be in the public eye their entire lives, the same way that Tony Stark was. And Robert Downey Jr. being the son of a very famous actor and having acted, his whole life, he's very familiar with the sort of attitudes and the sort of things that can develop in a person, psychologically and emotionally as they develop in that public eye.
Plus, Robert Downey Jr.'s character's backstory is really, really similar to Tony Stark's backstory in the comics.
Yes. Especially when you consider alcohol and drug addiction.
Yeah, that's what I was putting at. They're really very similar to his. That's
absolutely.
I think once you know that backstory of his, then you put together how great he is at him playing Iron Man. Yeah,
I agree. I think that it was a slam dunk of a pick, and obviously, RDJ just nails it. He's the heart and soul of the MCU. Like not to downplay anybody else, like Gwyneth Paltrow or Chris Evans or Chris Hemsworth or anybody else. Like everybody does an amazing job in their respective MCU roles. But I think it's safe to say that Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark is the heart and soul of the MCU, and I'm very interested to see what they're going to do
in the next 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah, it's exciting. It's really exciting.
I hope they don't use that time stone thing to bring them back. That in like 5 years, like they see they made a mistake and be like that would be a huge waste of his arc. And
I think you're absolutely right. I think that would be the waste of a really well constructed arc. And despite the fact that Marvel is notorious for, especially in the comics, and almost like specifically the comics, they're notorious for killing a character off dramatically and then surprise, like a few years later, like they come back from the dead in some weird way. That has worked out for them before sometimes, but then comic fans got really, really tired of that eventually, to the point where it almost became like a little bit of a joke.
Yeah,
like no one ever really dies in the Marvel universe.
I know it's like a joke with I think Captain America. I think like he's like died so many times in the comics, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and, I forget what it was.
All right, so all right, it's on now. So we were talking about the tropes and I was saying like how like you were saying it's like more like a joke now, and like Chris, I was saying like the Captain America has like died so much in the comics now.
Yes. The Marvel universe is now gotten sort of notorious about killing characters off dramatically and then bringing them back unbelievably via like strange. I think that they're going to do that. I think they released a statement that he's done playing the character, so I'm excited to see how the MCU unfolds without him as we move forward. But to wrap it up, to go back to what we were saying about film franchises and like how that all started and how that marketing model is now, like, I think that noticing that, or as soon as you learn that that's a thing and that's a sort of thread that Hollywood is following, you start to see it all over the. And it's sometimes a fun thing to notice, and sometimes it's a frustrating thing to notice. But it's something that's definitely there, and it's an interesting thing to sort of think about and learn about.
All right, is there anything you anything more you want to promote before we end the podcast?
I've got an audio drama coming out soon, directed by Nick Gregorio, written by Nick Gregorio, that I play a role in. That'll be releasing soon. I'll get you. It's called Not Like Us, and it'll be available somewhere soon. And also, as always, please, everybody out there, watch El Rey Nation. My show, along with Hector Navarro, Cameron Rice, Kelly Nugent, and Vanessa Gritton on El Rey Network on cable or on Amazon or iTunes. And thanks very much, James, for having me on. I love being on the show.
Thank you for being a only continuing guest.
I hope you had a good time talking to me. Thanks for letting me just like rant about all that shit for
no problem.
I really appreciate being on, man. Have a great one.
All right, bye. All right, so this is the end of the podcast, and sorry about all the interruptions. The call kept dropping in and out, so if you see like multiple cuts, that's why. I'll probably say something in the beginning. So I hope you enjoyed the podcast. I hope you enjoyed my guest Dan Mills, and go watch the shows that he mentioned. And please like and subscribe for more. James saying peace.
Right. I just want to shout out an amazing channel, James the Sheriff Dixon. Oh, he's such a great guy, and he is super cool for coming to the show. I'm glad I got to meet him in person, and you should subscribe.